Okay, so I'm going to talk about the arms sales topic, but the first thing, if you were here at the camp last year, the first thing that I began with, I'm going to reiterate this year, which is that to make the most out of camp, you have a lot of lectures, and you should begin by taking notes appropriately so that you can retain that information the easiest, which means that you should probably be taking notes by hand rather than your laptop. Now, today's the first day, you might not have a notebook, but for lecture tomorrow, show up with a notebook. Go and buy one if you don't have one. The reason for that is because there are very powerful studies that say that student retention is significantly less when they take notes on their laptop as opposed to taking notes by hand. And part of that is because students have incentives to multitask when you're on your laptop. There are a lot of distractions. You alt tab to your email account, or you start playing Tetris. And as a faculty member here for many years, sitting up there looking down on you, everybody that has a laptop does that at some point. So, you know, it's like, and you might think, well, you know, I'm listening to the lecture, but I'm also just checking my email right now, and you're right, you probably are still listening, but the real question is, can you retain it? And there's a lot of information in this lecture, and there's a lot of information in, you know, every lecture to come, and, you know, so like you might hear it and you might understand it, but you might not remember it, and that information is pretty important. So make the most use that you can from camp. Take notes by hand if you can. If you have to do it by your laptop today, that's fine, but you know, try not to multitask. This topic is an interesting topic. I like the topic. When I first started researching, I didn't like it at all. I was like, what is this? But now I really like it. I thought that it was a little bit more difficult to approach for me than other topics, mainly because I didn't have any experience with arms sales, and then partially because the topic is actually really complicated. I thought it wasn't very complicated when I first approached it. I thought it was pretty easy, but in some ways it's a lot more complicated than the immigration topic. And there's a lot of information that you have to learn to be competent when you read articles on this topic and when you start the process of research. So the goal of my lecture is to really help you understand, you know, everything that you need to know about the arms sales topic. I'm not really going to talk very much about specific affirmatives or really even specific arguments. I'm really just giving you hopefully what is enough background so that you can understand how U.S. arms sales policy works. One thing about this topic that I really like, and is unique from other topics, is that there's an expert in the arms control community. His name is Jeff Abramson, and he runs a site called Forum on the Arms Trade, which is basically this topic. It's like forum on the high school debate topic. Jeff Abramson is, you know, he's somebody that I contacted to ask him a couple of questions about something that I didn't understand about the lecture. I didn't know anything about him other than his bio, but I was asking him about a particular article that he wrote, and it turns out that he was a high school debater who debated for St. Mark's in the late 1980s, and he is more than willing to work with high school students to understand this topic. On his site, Forum on the Arms Trade, it's an amazing site. It's the most helpful site that I've seen on the topic so far. But he has actually set up a high school debate resources page where you can ask him questions or ask other experts questions. He has some instructions about how you go about doing that. You know, and I don't know, if he starts getting questions from 300 high school students at once, you know, maybe that, you know, it's probably not possible to respond to all of those questions. But at the same time, he is, you know, just for the purpose of preparing this lecture, I had a very long email conversation with him about certain parts of the topic that I didn't understand, and I found his advice very helpful. Not only was he really helpful in terms of explaining some things to me, but he also just sent me a bunch of articles to read on something that I was having difficulty finding articles on. So I think this topic, to me, is better than many of the previous topics that we've had, mainly just because it has a unique forum for interaction with topic experts, and not just topic experts, but at least one topic expert that understands what debate is and is willing to work with you. So I love that fact about the topic. I'm really excited about that. He hasn't totally finished the high school debate page, but it exists now, and you can definitely check it out. Just don't do it now. No multitasking. Okay. So this is just the structure of my lecture. I do want to say a couple things about the resolution. The resolution is a weird resolution from a topicality perspective because there aren't actually very many topicality arguments on this topic. I'll be talking a little bit about topicality in this lecture, but not very much. But like that statement is pretty straightforward. It just says, like foreign military sales and direct commercial sales, there's very little debate over what those terms mean. And, so if you think about like, there's a question of what does it mean to reduce in the context of arms sales, what constitutes a substantial reduction, but there's not really much debate over like what arms means, or what from the United States means, or what direct commercial sales means, or what foreign military sales is. So I will be talking a small amount about topicality, but not very much. And to be honest, like if you're thinking about, what are good topicality violations on the topic, there really aren't many. It's like the word substantial is going to be a part of debates, and there will be like bad debates over the word reduce, but there won't be, there's not really great topicality arguments in my opinion, so that isn't a huge focus of this lecture. I do want you to remember the resolution. I have a quiz based off this lecture, which is a bunch of questions that I'm giving to my lab, and some of the other lab leaders might give it to your lab, and the only question I'll tell you what is on the quiz. The first question is, you got to write down the resolution. Obviously, you have to memorize the resolution. If you haven't done so, you should. If you have, then you'll get that question right. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to talk about, the first section of my lecture is just arms from the United States. So my goal is to explain what constitutes arms, what is the U.S. role in the arms trade, and how much does the U.S. export every year. So the definition that's on that slide is really the only definition of arms that you need to know. I turned out a topicality for the file for the camp. There are dozens of definitions of the word arms, but you could safely delete them all and just use this definition. So this definition is from the Government Accountability Office, and there's a very similar definition from the Security Assistance Management Manual. And the reason this definition is the only one that matters is because it's the only one that really defines what arms means in the context of the resolution. There are a lot of different definitions of arms, and they are all irrelevant and worthless and not really about the topic. The topic references two specific programs, direct commercial sales and foreign military sales. This definition says arms refers to defense articles, defense services, and related technical data specified by USC or 22 U.S. Code Section 2778, which refers to the specific law, the Arms Export Control Act. The terms direct commercial sales and foreign military sales, those two programs, the way they were authorized, the way they came into being, was the Arms Export Control Act. It was a law passed in 1976 that, if you think about last year's topic, the INA is the foundation for the topic, the Immigration and Nationality Act. For this year's topic, the equivalent of the INA is the AECA. So it is the most authoritative source when you're talking about what are arms, and what are direct commercial sales, and what are foreign military sales. This is the legal framework for the topic. And then it says, and defined in 22 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 120, which refers to the regulations that implement the AECA, which is called the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, ITAR. So when Congress passed the AECA, the President passed an executive order which delegated enforcement authority of the AECA to the Department of State. And the Department of State came up with a body of regulations that they called the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. As part of that ITAR, as part of those regulations, they created something called the U.S. Munitions List, which is a very, very long list, 21 different sections of items that require an export license to export. but not just items, but instead defense articles, defense services, and related technical data. So when you think about what is an ARM in the context of this topic, the answer is anything that is on the US munitions list probably constitutes an ARM. Now that list is huge. There are thousands of different possible arms that would qualify. But we're talking here about defense articles, defense services, and related technical data. So what are those things? A defense article is literally anything that's on the US munitions list designed for defense purposes. A defense service is not a weapon, but is nonetheless an arm. And there's no real way to exclude services from the topic. A defense service is something that helps make weapons work, potentially. So help for the design of a weapon, maintenance of a weapon, training how to use a weapon, help to remove weapons. So if a country wants to get rid of some old equipment that they got from the United States, a service we might provide is how to destroy those weapons and disarm that country. Potentially, technically counts as an arm under the AECA definition of arms. Technical data is just information related to defense articles or defense services. So examples of technical data might be a blueprint, or it might be a 3D printing design for a particular weapon, and it might be the part of that program that you feed into a 3D printer that tells the printer what to print. And the AECA covers all of that. So the AECA says you have to have an export license to export anything on the US munitions list. And that is basically governed by the Foreign Military Sales and Direct Commercial Sales Program. And what constitutes an export? An export is anything that we send to another country. So an export of technical data could actually just be a phone call where you call somebody up and tell them how something works. If you don't have a license for that under the AECA, because what you're talking about is on the US munitions list, that is technically a violation and not legal. Or if you send somebody an email, technical data is an arm under the AECA definition and therefore requires an export license or requires to be sold under the Foreign Military Sales Program. So I'll talk a lot more in detail about that, but the very first thing that I wanted to kind of talk to you is just the basic legal framework for the topic. Now, there are two things on this list that I haven't mentioned. So the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 is the other major law that governs transfers of arms to other countries. Having said that, it is important to know, but it's nowhere near as important as the AECA. The Foreign Assistance Act covers all foreign assistance in US code. There are 700 sections of the Foreign Assistance Act, and very little of it is relevant to the topic. There are portions that do relate to foreign military sales and, significantly, the transfer of arms outside of FMS and DCS categories. So you will need to know about those. I'm not going to talk about that part for a while, but the Foreign Assistance Act is an important law to know just because it provides, a legal basis for all foreign aid, but determines potential channels to export arms that are outside of the topic categories, which is potentially a problem for the affirmative. And then the Security Assistance Management Manual is out of all the things up here to know, that's maybe the least important thing, but at the same time, it's still important. It is basically the way that the Department of Defense has interpreted how to run the foreign military sales program. So in the context of the State Department, when the State Department was developing regulations to determine how do we implement the AECA, they came up with ITAR and the US munitions list. The Defense Department is also very much related to the export of arms, and their version of regulations basically came up with a Security Assistance Management Manual, which is essentially a list of rules and principles that the Department of Defense has to follow when it exports arms or when it participates in an arms sale. So it is important in the sense that, as an authoritative source to interpret what the topic means, the Security Assistance Manual is actually a fantastic place to read about, if you have questions about how do arms sales work. You can just go to the DoD website and look up ESAM for Electronic Security Assistance Management Manual, and it has, I think, at least 15 different chapters, and the majority of them are really informative and pretty useful to read if you're interested in learning about the process. But it does have some relatively important definitions on the topic, and like I said, this particular definition is probably the only definition of arms that you need in the context of the topic, but there is an alternate definition that's very similar to that definition from the Security Assistance Manual Management Manual that I would probably keep. Okay. There are other definitions of arms. I wanted to put this up here mainly because there are a few things in it that I want to talk about. I don't think this is a particularly good definition. Like I said, you can actually delete all of the other arms definitions if you choose. But this is, probably the reason I'm putting this up here is because it is very descriptive of what arms actually look like. So the other definition is a very technical legal definition that is the only actual definition that fits the topic. This definition is not inconsistent with the other definition because this was from the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, an agency that does not exist any longer but it was a Department of State agency that in 1999, I think, was just folded into the overall Department of State and reorganized. So that agency doesn't exist, but they do have a definition of arms that is pretty descriptive of what an arms transfer might represent. And I'm not going to read the definition, but I do want to mention two things about this that are important. So number one is that it says that small arms, in other words, firearms, things that can be carried by an individual troop, small arms are part of arms shipments or arms exports, which is obviously correct. But there are some definitions that say small arms are not part of that. And the reason that those definitions exist is because it has to do with how organizations measure arms. So it's really hard to keep track of small arms. How many small arms do we export? We have figures, it's about roughly 800 million a year, but how much confidence do we have in those particular figures? Not a ton, because it's very difficult to keep accurate records about the number of small arms that are actually exported, especially on a global level. So a lot of agencies or different organizations that measure arms transfers don't include things like small arms because it's just too difficult to actually keep track of them. They aren't saying, when they say our definition of arms only includes major conventional weapons and not small arms and light weapons, then they aren't saying that the word arms excludes small arms and light weapons. They're just saying that the methodology they used when they tracked arms shipments does not include small arms and light weapons, mainly just because it's difficult for them to keep track of all of those exports. So it's just something to know. There are some topicality cards that are small arms aren't topical. Those cards are garbage. The other thing that this is important for is that it mentions dual-use equipment. Dual-use equipment is equipment that has both a civilian and a military purpose. So, for example, a satellite part that the military uses in reconnaissance, like a spy satellite, that could potentially have a civilian use, could be used in a civilian remote sensing satellite as well. And for the most part, the AECA list, the US munitions list, is not really about dual-use equipment. There's certainly some dual-use equipment that falls under that list, But this definition, the reason I like this definition is because it says dual-use equipment which can have application in military and civilian sectors is included when the primary mission is identified as military. So some dual-use items are on the U.S. munitions list because the State Department and the Department of Defense have judged that the primary purpose of it is military, even if it has some civilian uses. So like tires on a US military jet are technically dual use, but the primary purpose is to fit a particular jet design and therefore is considered a munition. Okay. All right, so this chart is a list of the top 25 global arms exporters. The US is number 1 with 36% of the total. Russia is number 2 with 21% of the total, and then you can see everybody else is much less. The US market share has significantly increased. So, over that, it has always been number 1, but it has generally begun to increase its overall market share. This is also like a useful list in that it gives you a set of top clients for each arms exporter, which is pretty relevant. So like I think it's important to know that Russia's primary client is India, for example. So if an affirmative is reading an aft to cut arms sales to India, then the possibility of Russia filling in for the US is very significant and highly likely against that particular affirmative. So I think that's useful to know. I don't have much else to say about this particular chart. It's just data, but I think it's interesting data that provides context for the topic that you need to know. And I would say it's like probably relevant to know at least the top 5 weapons exporters, mainly because Russia and China will be significant disadvantages on the topic. Both Russia and China want to increase their market share. They're trying to directly compete with the United States, but mostly failing. Because the US is the number 1 arms exporter in the world and has been forever. The other thing, this data comes from an organization called SIPRI, which stands for the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. It is probably the number 1 non-governmental organization that is an authority on the arms trade. So when you read any media article, like any news report that talks about the US percentage of the arms trade and so forth, more likely than not, that is quoting SIPRI. And SIPRI, is credible. I think they're a great organization. But there are definitely a few things about their data that's a little weird. So the first thing is that when they measure the arms trade, they don't measure that in terms of its financial value. They use a measure that they made up called trend indicator value, which is definitely a term you have to know. And TIV is based upon what SIPRI estimates is the production cost of each arm based upon $1990. So to prevent against inflation, they use one standard economic metric. They compare it based upon what would this have gone for in 1990? And they try to standardize that between all countries. So when you're trying to measure how much does an arm cost, not every transaction is in dollars. There's inflation. There are, sometimes an item is sold for a lot more than it actually costs to make. So SIPRI tries to cut through all of that and just look at what was the production cost of that weapon. And if the production cost isn't known, then SIPRI measures that against what is the average production cost for similar weapons on the market. So if they didn't know how much it costs to make an F-22 plane, they might look at a comparable plane that Russia sold or a comparable plane that Israel sold and look at the production costs of that to try to estimate what the value of it was based off the United States. So there's definitely a lot of ambiguity within SIPRI's data. The other thing, probably more significant, is that SIPRI leaves out a lot in their calculations. So they only talk about major conventional weapons. They expressly do not include small arms and light weapons, which is in the literature, you'll see the acronym SALW, small arms and light weapons. That's just what that means. You know, they don't track that because it's too difficult for them to track it. SIPRI also omits a good portion of services. So services, the services part of the topic is a little bit strange and a little bit ambiguous. I probably should have said a little bit more about that on the other slide. But so like services does, you know, when you think about services, like most of the literature revolves around things like maintenance and repair and like resupply for you know, weapons that a particular country buys. So like the number one weapons related service is actually the maintenance of aircraft. But services is unfortunately includes a significant portion of services for direct commercial sales, includes US private military contractors that do not go to other countries' governments. They instead go to US military bases to help US bases function appropriately. So for example, if we need to resupply one of our own bases, we might hire a private company to do that, and that is weirdly can be included as a direct commercial sale. And there are some authors that actually say the vast majority of direct commercial sales services are not services given to other countries, but are services given to US forces overseas. Now there's like potentially a topicality argument that excludes that. I'm not going to talk about it in this lecture, but SIPRI would not include that data under what constitutes a direct commercial sale. So their estimate compared to other estimates appears lower if you are looking at the financial value of something that SIPRI provides, mainly because SIPRI doesn't actually, the dollar value that they provide is not a financial value. It is not comparable to any other metric. It has some limitations. But the flip side of that is SIPRI is also considered the most credible source, mainly because they have 50 years of data, so they started doing this before anybody else did, and because they rigorously evaluate their sources. So generally before SIPRI makes an estimate, they have to look at least 5 sources to support that estimate, so they don't just look at official US government figures or official government figures of other countries. They include, you know, things like newspaper articles, journals, reports from independent organizations, and so forth. So it, you know, by most organizations, SIPRI is considered the most credible source, but like their accounting method is a little bit weird because you can't say like, hey, SIPRI says this number and our other evidence says this number. Those two things don't match. They'll never match because SIPRI uses its own methodology to create particular sources. The reason I think SIPRI is useful, is maybe more useful than other estimates, is because they have one standard way to evaluate how, you know, what constitutes military value. It is more useful to track changes over time with SIPRI's data than any other data. All data on this topic is somewhat unreliable, but SIPRI's data, because they aren't looking at potential inflation or the price of a sale that could potentially be far more than what the sale was actually worth, they are only tracking military value. So they're saying, so if SIPRI says arms sales increased from, you know, one year to another, SIPRI is probably more credible than other sources, as long as you're only talking about major conventional weapons and services related to those weapons. Okay, this next chart is, this chart and the chart that follows it are 2 charts in the topicality file. They are charts that one of my debaters created and I replicated based upon SIPRI data. So SIPRI data is a little bit hard to use. Anybody can go to their website. They have something called the Arms Transfer Database, which is an incredibly useful tool, and you can input a lot of different values that, if you want, what are the percentage of arms exports over this particular range of years to what countries, SIPRI can tell you what that is. But the problem with SIPRI's data is that, for debate purposes, is that it's really hard to read. So they'll basically give you a Microsoft Excel file that has all of those values in it. These charts are using Microsoft Excel to represent those values in a visual form. So like these values are based upon data within SIPRI's actual chart. You can look at the Excel file or you can look at their web output, but just like presenting that chart by itself in a debate round does not tell you very much, because it's really just a random series of numbers that requires a little bit of thought to think about what they mean. So this chart, I think, is helpful. This chart is the same way that SIPRI generates their charts. So like my debater actually emailed the head of the arms transfer project at SIPRI and asked them about their charts, because they provided a chart for 2017 but not 2018, and she was like, how did you create this chart? And and that SIPRI person told them, and then sent her an Excel file, which was just something that anybody could just get out of the SIPRI arms transfer database. So all this is a visual representation of that data. And I think that's useful in the sense that it shows these are the export destinations so these are the top US clients. Now we export to, over the last 5 years, we've exported to 98 countries, which is a lot. The topic is pretty big if you include all 98 of those countries. But these are the top clients that the US has. You can see that Saudi Arabia is by far #1, and that hasn't really changed. Sometimes the position of these other countries changes a little bit, but generally these are our top customers. And almost everybody else on the list of 98 is really, really small, like incredibly small. Like might be a single arms sale in a particular year and not every year. The reason this range is 5 years is because data based upon a single year is not very reliable or informative, because data based on a single year tells you maybe what we delivered or notified Congress about in that year, but it may not have actually gone through. So it's possible we notified Congress about a sale, it was reported as a sale, but that sale was never actually delivered, so that sale never actually happened, even though the data might suggest it did. Or in 1 year, we might export a lot more than we might in year number 2, mainly because the customer has different needs. So if the customer buys $10 billion worth of arms in 1 year, in year 2, they're not going to buy very much. They'll buy like services to resupply those arms, but it will look really small. So looking at a single year is probably insufficient. 5 years is probably better. You could make it more than 5 years if you chose. The SIPRI database gives you a lot of flexibility. The second chart basically tells you what we've exported. So primarily aircraft, and then missiles, armored vehicles, etc. The list is actually really, really long, because that other category, even though it's tiny, includes a million things. So if you think about just kind of the raw size of the topic, it's like we export thousands of different weapons to at least 98 countries, and technically more because a couple of international organizations were included over the last 5 years. So the breadth of what constitutes arms exports is very large. Okay, this next chart, I guess it's not really a chart. These are different measures of how much foreign military sales and direct commercial sales we send every year. So the State Department has a whole lot of different numbers. Those numbers are weird and confusing. And that 179 billion number, the site that I got that from, like I originally cut that card in early May, and that number was actually quite a bit lower. And then I went back to it for some reason like 2 days ago, and they had updated it to be 179 billion. But that's a little bit, these statistics are a little bit crazy. The State Department basically has two primary ways of tracking arms sales. One is called the WMET report, which is like the World Military Expenditures and Arms Transfers report, which they did release a report in 2018, but it was only about 2016 data, so not super helpful. The other thing is called a Section 655 report, which is Section 655 of the Foreign Assistance Act. That's just a requirement that both state and the Department of Defense have to release figures at the end of each year of how many arms that they've sold. But like figuring that out, where this data came from exactly, is really hard. So those first three figures that you have from on this list are all cards that are in the topicality file. They all come from various State Department sources. None of them say how the State Department came up with those particular figures. So all roughly the same period seem to be describing the same data, and yet we have 3 different conclusions and 4 different conclusions if you include the earlier revision of that 179 billion figure. Now, compared to that, we have the Security Assistance Monitor, which is like this super credible US organization that tracks arms sales from the US government. They do that based upon looking at how many congressional notifications for arms sales are made every year. And then they also track that over year, so sometimes they have to revise it if the actual deliveries were less than the notification. And they say last year it was only 79 billion, which is a pretty substantial variation in the data. Okay, so this is a card from, he was a former head of SIPRI. I think the evidence from this author is pretty spectacular, but I think that the relevant part of this card, you can read it on your own, but I'll just read the relevant part, which is that estimates of the total financial value of the international arms trade in 2014 range from 54.1 billion to 188 billion. Now that is a total value for the entire global arms trade, not just the US. And he says, the surprising thing is that both of these extreme estimates come from different parts of the US government. The Congressional Research Service, they have a database called the Conventional Arms Transfer to Developing Nations database, which even though it says to developing nations, it actually applies to everyone. And then WMET, which I explained previously. So there's a lot of variation in the data, and the data is extremely unreliable, which is part of the reason I spent a little bit of time talking about SIPRI, because SIPRI is potentially a better source than US government official estimates. But that doesn't mean US government official estimates are necessarily wrong. So I have a list of questions of how do you interpret that data? So the first question is, does the data include services? And the answer is maybe, but maybe not. So let me go back to this list. 150 billion figure. The 40 billion for FMS does not include services. The 110 billion in DCS does. Why? I have no idea. It's mystifying. FMS services are generally about 1/3 of the total value of FMS. And then the second two figures, it's unclear whether or not either of those include services. It's just like the source, what the State Department said is not clear at all about it. The 136 billion definitely includes DCS services. Why that's different from 110 billion, which also includes DCS services, also very unclear. So that question, I think, is like one thing to think about when you look at that data. Does the DCS figure include DCS to US armed forces in that? So you look at the Security Assistance Monitor, the answer to that is no. So the security assistance monitor for DCS, 30 billion versus 136 billion, that's a huge variation. What is going on here based off of like what happened in 2018? You know, a big part of that variation is it excludes services to US military bases, or maybe it excludes the entire DCS services category overall, which is huge, and the vast majority of DCS services actually goes to US military bases. So that Perlow-Friedman person that I showed you the quote from, his argument is that we should not be talking about DCS services at all because like it has very little to do with actual arms transfers. Okay, third question, is it a single year or is it an average based upon multiple years? That's, you know, there are a lot of different estimates. You just have to read cards with a critical eye. Usually the article will say. Does every source have the same definition of arms? The answer is no. SIPRI is obviously more limited than what the US defines. Is it based upon deliveries, notifications, or contracts? So I'll show you this slide. This is from the Security Assistance Monitor, one of their databases where you can input a bunch of values and get reports off of it. This is for, I believe, 2014 to 2018. And it shows you the difference between a notification, an authorization, and a delivery. So when a notification occurs, that means either the Department of Defense or Department of State notifies Congress that they are making an arms sale. The authorization is usually going to be the same or less than the notification, because that's the actual thing that the client state agrees to. So we might notify Congress that we're sending $110 billion to Saudi Arabia, but if Saudi Arabia only signs a contract for $100 billion, then the authorization would be $100 billion and not $110 billion. And then the delivery is the actual amount of arms that were delivered in that calendar year. Now, deliveries lag substantially behind authorizations and notifications. Usually an authorization and a notification would occur in the same year. A delivery might not occur for 10 years later because it takes time to build weapons. And a lot of the time when we authorize a sale, got to spend a lot of time building the weapon itself. Okay. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Before 1990, with the use that dollar value, is there data from pre-1990 also using that dollar value?
I don't know what the pre-1990 data is based on. Okay. Yep.
Deliveries metric, is that based on like the dollar value of the stuff sold to the country or what they paid for the things we sold them?
It's not based on what they paid. It's based, you mean that deliveries figure there? That is based upon the dollar amount that we sold it for them, because that's not SIPRI's metric. That's, the Security Assistance Monitor is tracking what the US has formally delivered. Okay, so section 2, foreign military sales. I'm going to try to get through this section and then I'll give you a break and then we'll talk about direct commercial sales after that. Okay, so this is a definition from the Security Assistance Management Manual. Again, likely the only definition of this word that you need, which defines it as, well, you can read it yourself. I'm not going to read it. There are 3 things to know about this definition. First, foreign military sales are government-to-government transfers. So the US government is involved in making the sale, is what that means. Second, it involves a formal contract between the Department of Defense and the weapons procure, the defense contractor, and the purchasing country. And third is that it is entirely managed by the Department of Defense. Now, that's a little bit deceptive because the State Department has authority over foreign military sales, but the Department of Defense is the agency that implements foreign military sales. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process overall. This is a chart that I took from a PowerPoint from somebody at Defense Acquisition University, which is apparently a US government university run by the Department of Defense that is for the purpose of explaining how sales occur. But it's basically what I just described to you. So what happens is, in brief, the foreign government contacts the US government. They issue a letter of request, which is like, hey, we want to buy 10 fighter jets. The US government talks to the industry, or they look at their own stock. So foreign military sale can come from excess defense stock. Like if the US just has like 10 jets lying around that they don't want to use, unlikely, it doesn't happen very much. Or more likely, they talk to a defense contractor and they say, hey, Saudi Arabia wants to buy 10 jets. We would like to make this contract happen. Can you produce these 10 jets? For what price? When can you deliver them? Can you fulfill the order? And if the contractor agrees, then the US responds with an LOA, which is called a letter of offer and acceptance. And if the country signs that LOA, then there is a contract that occurs. The Department of Defense cannot profit or lose from a foreign military sale, according to the Foreign Assistance Act. That they're prohibited from profiting or having a loss from a sale. They charge a 3.2% surcharge to cover administrative costs for negotiating a contract with a private industry. Why do they need a contract? Because if something goes wrong, that contract tells courts how to navigate it. So they might cover, like, what happens if one of the jets is really defective and explodes on delivery? That is governed by the contract. There's insurance clauses within the contract that say that. What happens if the US government doesn't fulfill its end of the bargain and breaks the contract? Then potentially the foreign government could sue the United States based upon that letter of offer and acceptance. So they can do a foreign military sale either for like providing services, providing just information. They can sell information, or they can actually build the item. Okay, agencies. These agencies are all pretty relevant. If you do any reading on the topic, you will see a lot of evidence that refers to these particular agencies. So the entire process is run by the Department of State through the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which you should always just flow as PM. The Bureau of Political Military Affairs has two sub-agencies. So the Office of Regional Security and Arms Transfers is the starting point of contact for a foreign military sale. So they would initially send that letter of request to the Office of Regional Security and Arms Transfers. The Directorate of Defense Trade Controls is a little bit more important because it is the agency that makes recommendations of should we actually sell this to the other country? Is that country a security risk? Do we want to export this technology? Is it sensitive? They make those decisions and recommend whether or not the sale should be approved. And then it is implemented by the Department of Defense. The primary agency, probably the most important agency you need to know about for foreign military sales is the DSCA, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. They are basically in charge of the entire process. The other two things that I have up there, the Defense Technology and Security Agency, that is very similar to the DoD's version of the DTTC. So they offer the US military perspective of, is this sale a security risk? Should we actually give them that technology? And then the individual military departments are also, like the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, they're contacted for their input about whether or not a sale is advisable. Okay, I'm I'm going to go kind of quickly through these steps just because of time reasons. I may not get through this, so we'll see. But there are technically like 8 steps for how a foreign military sale occurs. I've consolidated these to 5 steps, which I think some are a little bit more important than others. Step 1 is the pre-LOR phase. This is actually very important because this is how the United States gets countries to be interested in US defense technology. So you can think of the pre-LOR phase as marketing, where every country that has a US embassy has something called a Security Cooperation Office, which is staffed by security cooperation officers, which are weirdly both referred to as SCO in the literature. But the SCO in a US embassy is the part of the US embassy that is initially the point of contact. So they might go to a country and say, hey, we think you need these items. We think that your military would be improved by having a few more jets. And we have the latest and greatest technology, so obviously why wouldn't you want to buy it? That's kind of the initial starting point, for contact. But like I said, I've listed a few other things up there about like how we might market military sales. Lobbying from a defense contractor could occur for where the defense contractor goes to Saudi Arabia itself and is like, hey, Saudi Arabia, we would like to show you, we have this awesome new technology that you would be really, would make your killing of civilians more efficient. And Saudi Arabia will be like, wow, okay. Or they can go to the Department of Defense and be like, hey, we think that Saudi Arabia's war would be a little bit more efficient if they had this technology. Can you talk to them and make sure that they actually buy this item or like a greater quantity of these particular items? That lobbying can occur through like official military training programs. So when we take officers from Saudi Arabia and they come to the United States to figure out, and they go to like US military schools to figure out how to be a better military officer, we might also be like, hey, and while you're here, you may as well like read this brochure about how great our jets are at killing people. So that's the pre-LOR phase. Step 2 is the letter of request. So one thing to know about sales on this topic is that all sales, direct commercial sales or foreign military sales, are initiated by the purchasing country. So we can have marketing, we should be like, we think you should buy this. But the actual sale itself is initiated by the purchasing country. So they send a letter to the Security Cooperation Officer. The Security Cooperation Officer sends that letter to the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs and the RSAT and also the DSCA. This requires a country team assessment, which is a legal requirement under the law that says that we have to provide a formal justification for why that sale is necessary. Does it violate human rights? Are there risks associated with that sale? So there are a lot of affirmatives, a lot of solvency advocates that are like, we should increase human rights protections for arms sales. We should require us not to sell things to arms violators. But technically, that's the status quo. Now, it's not really what those authors are saying. The authors are saying the status quo way of doing that is totally backwards. But we do have that human rights requirement now. It's just not enforced very well. One other thing, just a vocabulary word, is interoperability. So for a foreign military sale, all sales have to be interoperable with US military equipment. And what that means is that they have to be able to work together. So if you think about it like operating systems, if you have Microsoft Word on Windows, it's not going to run on a Mac machine. And if you use Microsoft's version of Mac Word, then you know that it's not very interoperable. So in this context, basically, interoperability means that the item that is sold must be used by the US military currently or in future military plans, because the goal is for the United States to be able to train with those military forces. And then the more insidious goal is to lock in dependence, because somebody who's been using all of these different US systems, it becomes very hard for them to switch to a different supplier. You know, like if you've done everything on a Windows machine and all of a sudden you switch to a Mac, you've basically got to throw out everything that you knew about computers. Okay. This is an actual country team assessment. I'm not going to read it, but I included this because I wanted to demonstrate like how these are not really enforced. So what is a country team assessment? It's a requirement that the sale not violate human rights, that it is safe for regional security, that it's in US interests. So what it actually looks like, this isn't the whole thing, I omitted part of it, but the parts that I omitted were just like, what is this sale? But this was a country team assessment that was made for Saudi Arabia over like them buying $1.3 billion of new equipment, I think like jets, or actually I don't remember what it was. But you know, their assessment is basically like, it would be safe. Why? Because we like looked at it and it was safe and it doesn't violate human rights. You know, you don't have to provide evidence or a formal like reason. This is something that meets the letter of the law, but is not very satisfying because it doesn't actually do anything. Okay, step 3, congressional notification. This part's super important to know. For most sales, Congress has 30 days to block a proposed sale. First thing you need to know is, when does that congressional notification period trigger? It is triggered after the letter of request. So there's a letter of request, and before we can initiate an offer to them, we have to notify Congress. We have generally 30 days, Congress has 30 days to review the sale and potentially issue a joint resolution of disapproval, which is like a normal congressional law, but it only requires 50 votes to pass in the Senate instead of, like there's no filibuster requirement. When we notify Congress, we usually do that by making the sale public on the Federal Register or the DSCA website. That is the first time the sale becomes public. Usually everything up to that phase is secret. So we don't know what the letter of request is. There's some statistics about like different types of sales have different notification requirements. So like not everything we sell requires congressional notification. It's everything over a certain dollar value, and I've listed those dollar values. Major defense equipment is defined in the law as items with a production cost of more than $200 million and a research and development cost of more than $50 million. You probably don't need to know that. This is like very relevant to the topic and current events though. So, you know, right now, Trump with Saudi Arabia issued a national security declaration, invoked a waiver in the AECA to say that he was going to proceed with that sale regardless of congressional notification. Now, why would he do that? The number of times that Congress has successfully exercised a joint resolution of disapproval in history is 0. Congress has never successfully blocked an arms sale. So why does Trump need to bypass the congressional notification process? And the reason is because of something called a legislative hold that one US Senator, Robert Menendez from New Jersey, I think, issued what is a legislative hold that prevents Congress from actually responding to the notification period until he is satisfied that the State Department has satisfied his request for information. So before that notification occurs, before the official notification clock begins, the State Department informs the top Democrat and top Republican on both the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that we are going to notify Congress about this sale. And Senator Menendez, a Democrat, in the context of sales to Saudi Arabia was like, I'm not going to let this notification proceed. So if the notification proceeds, then Congress would vote on it. They would probably successfully pass a joint resolution of disapproval, but it would be vetoed by the president and wouldn't go anywhere. So it would happen. The problem is, for the last year, Senator Menendez has had this hold. It's like, we're not going to have the congressional notification period. It's not going to start. So Trump, in response, said that there's a national security waiver in the AECA that says I don't have to follow that congressional notification requirement if this is in a vital national security interest for the United States. That waiver prior to Trump doing this has been exercised 4 times in the past. It was exercised by Reagan in the context of a sale to Saudi Arabia, where he was like, Iran is a threat. We need to make sure the sale to Saudi Arabia goes through quickly. We can't wait for congressional notification. Trump is doing the same thing. He's just said that, he said Iran is a threat. The sale has to go to Saudi Arabia quickly. We can't hold this up for a year because Saudi Arabia has a vital national interest in killing Yemeni civilians. So therefore, and the US has a vital national interest in making money. Okay. So step 4 is the LOA. This is the actual contract. So after notification has occurred and Congress has said yes or no, and struggled to block a sale in the context of Saudi Arabia but failed, then the U.S. issues a letter of offer and acceptance, which basically tells the purchasing country that we will make these particular items available at this particular price with these particular conditions. You have 85 days to sign it. Saudi Arabia has 180 days to sign it. I don't know why, but they do. Most have 85. And if they sign it, then the sale goes through. So production of the item doesn't occur until the LOA is signed. Every LOA has multiple conditions for sale that are vague platitudes that are very similar to the country team assessment. So I included an example. This is word for word, one of the conditions in the DoD's standard LOA. So a standard LOA is they just have a form that they send out to that country, and they fill in like the actual sales data and delivery date and so forth. But that includes conditions of sale that are just like, you can't violate human rights, you can't divert this weapon to a third country, you can't like use it to kill civilians. Not enforced at all, but exists for every LOA. And then step 5 is end-use monitoring. Actually, technically step 5 is the delivery of the sale, so it takes potentially years between the LOA is signed and the actual item is delivered. But the last step in the process is called end-use monitoring, which is definitely a term you have to know. It's potentially a counterplan on the topic. It's all throughout the literature. And this is the U.S., the way the United States tries to verify that the equipment is not being misused, that it is only used for its intended purpose, and the official intended purpose is always that country's self-defense. So, the things that the U.S. is technically concerned about for end-use monitoring, they don't want other countries to violate human rights. So, in theory, if they determined that it was being used to indiscriminately kill civilians, then end-use monitoring would say we cannot sell things to this country in the future. The same thing is like violations of international law, and then most importantly, diversion to a third country. So the U.S. wants to make sure that we don't give somebody proprietary defense technology that is exported to a country that we don't want to have that technology. The DoD's version of end-use monitoring is the program called Golden Century. The State Department's version is called Blue Lantern, states only applies to direct commercial sales, DoD's only applies to foreign military sales. Now, the reality of end-use monitoring is that even though there are formal conditions for human rights, those conditions are not the thing that people look at. An end-use monitor, somebody who goes to verify that the country has not sold that equipment to somebody that they are not supposed to sell it to. So really the only actual concern that an end-use monitor has is that US technology is not diverted. There are people that say we should actually enforce the human rights component of it. It's not being enforced now. It definitely exists, and they're supposed to do it. They don't do it. Part of the reason they don't do it, the State Department doesn't have enough staff. The State Department's program is a lot worse than the Department of Defense's program. I read one statistic that said that the Department of State only monitors 1% of all direct commercial sales, but of that 1%, they found a violation 25% of the time. So, but they're really understaffed and can't really enforce end-use monitoring. Okay, a couple more things about FMS that you need to know. Foreign military financing is a term of art. It refers to a program in the Foreign Assistance Act. It is not part of foreign military sales, but its only purpose is to make foreign military sales possible. So it would not be topical for an affirmative to do something about foreign military financing. But at the same time, foreign military financing is basically, it's called a loan program, but it's really a grant that helps some countries pay for sales. So it's like, hey, you can't afford the sale, we'll give you money so you can buy it. Most of it goes to Israel and Egypt, but it actually goes to a lot of countries. It's mostly only available for foreign military sales. We call it a loan, but we've said that it is not repayable, so it is not a loan, it is a grant. The Trump administration wants to turn part of the FMF program into loans, because then we could potentially sell more in theory. Okay, the last thing that you need to know about FMS is that some items are designated as FMS only. And what that means is it can't be sold through the direct commercial sales program. It has to be sold through FMS. Normal Department of Defense policy, they do not care whether or not something goes through FMS or DCS. But for certain items that are deemed sensitive, items that they don't want to be diverted to a third country, those are declared FMS only items. The president can change this at will, and in fact recently changed it for drones. So in 2018, drones that were for military purposes, so drones that had laser sighting on them, they were designated as FMS only, and Trump was like, this FMS only designation means that we can't sell as many drones as we want to sell, and we want to sell all of the drones. So therefore he changed it to put that program in direct commercial sales. So part of the reason I break this up, because I almost didn't include this in my lecture, but this is an interesting part of the topic, because the topic does not say reduce arms sales, it just says reduce either DCS or FMS. So in that drone example, technically an affirmative team could say no direct commercial sales of drones. They can be sold through FMS now. If they were to only ban direct commercial sales of drones, then they effectively make that drone program FMS only again. Now, I don't know if that's a good half. It was one of the first things that I looked into, and it seems that the literature is very, very neg, because a whole lot of people think that we should sell drones. But it's technically an affirmative that might not actually reduce drone sales very much, and nonetheless decreases direct commercial sales, but maybe causes an increase in foreign military sales. So that's at least some part of the topic that you can think of. I don't know if there are actually good cases about this, but I'd be thinking, when you're thinking about like what are new apps that people could read, I might include apps on that based upon that particular example on the list, because it's definitely something that somebody that probably wants to be unduly tricky might do. Okay, we're going to take a break for 10 minutes, and I'm going to resume at 11:30 talking about direct commercial sales.
How does FMF allocate? Is it like a certain amount, like annually per country, or is it per weapons?
Usually per country, and it's determined by the Department of State.
Okay, so they get like a certain amount, and then that's what they have for all year.
Yeah.
So in what ways does the federal government prevent diversion from countries besides just checking serial?
Besides what?
Just checking, like you mentioned that they just like check serial numbers and access physical security. Are there like other ways?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah, there could be others, but I haven't read anything.
The U.S. doesn't profit in terms of the military sales that you talked about besides the 3.2% fee. Is most of the incentive for doing that just to like offset some of the R&D costs, or what's the motivation for the U.S. selling guns besides for like allies and stuff?
So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next section. Probably not in the direct commercial sales section, but when I get to like talking a little bit about Trump policy, I'll just say that for everyone. But it's basically, we have a lot of different interests, and the economics part of it, like we don't directly profit, but it still benefits the defense industry.
And for companies, like if you were a defense manufacturer, is there one avenue that would be more profitable, or are they roughly?
Defense manufacturers usually prefer direct commercial sales, but they do both.
For induced monitoring, is there any like consequence if there is a violation that the US government, or is it just?
Well, they could say we're not going to sell arms to you in the future. Like that's the most direct thing. They, whether or not that means like we're going to give you a stern talking to and make sure that you actually do this and then try it again, and if they do it again, then maybe we cut it off. I don't know. I haven't read any real cases of when like they've caught diversion, what happens in that instance. Most of what I've read about induced monitoring is just like why it's wholly insufficient because of just the size of the arms sales versus the scope of each program.
I have a question about the technical data aspect of arms. Is it only data pertaining to like these weapons, or is it like data on like surveillance data that is surveillance?
It's only related to arms. Yeah.
Does the U.S. like import a lot of arms as well, or?
We are the 16th largest importer of weapons, but the amount that we import is very small.
We were wondering if you think the EUM counterclaim might be a topic.
There is a proposal for making EUM as a condition of sale, that like anybody that violates EUM automatically gets no future sales.
Okay.
So
I
potentially.
guess it would make it easier to get FMS. Like it would make it harder to get FMS. So it'd be tough. But I don't think that would that be a reduction?
So I have a section that I'm going to talk about that for everyone, including the EUM example.
You mentioned like the defense contractors are used to help lobby other countries. Are these like private contractors?
Yeah, all defense contractors are private.
Okay. So then you also mentioned that the DoD can't profit or lose. Is the surcharge used to help make it so that they don't lose money if they buy something?
It's to like cover their costs of negotiating a contract, like administrative costs, and We actually, we have a surplus fund, like the surcharge. We sometimes waive the surcharge because we have like a fund where that money is just sitting that, we've technically made a profit. It's not a profit because we aren't allowed to like spend it on other things. It's just really just to cover administrative costs.
Is there a reason why there are like lots of different government agencies that had interpretations of how many arms sales are sold in countries? Because it seems like there might be
So it's like, yeah, it's very hard to explain. I'll say there's a lot of evidence in the topicality file that attacks it, and I didn't go through every reason, but a big part of the reason between discrepancies is transparency surrounding direct commercial sales is very low, and it's easier to track FMS than it is DCS. So like when they say those FMS figures are likely accurate, except for whether or not they include services or not, the DCS figures are like mainly responsible for the huge variation. So like DCS is usually a license between, like the government approves a license between a private industry and a foreign government. So what we report as DCS really depends upon the private contractor, what they're reporting as a sale. So the variation with it is all over the place.
So is there like a certain government agency that's more reliable on the
Not according to some RFRs. Like there's most people that talk about bad statistics say the problem is DCS, and the problem is like states variation, states data goes all over the place. And the Congressional Research Service, so I should have maybe said this in the lecture, but the Congressional Research Service, where they have a very low end estimate, the reason they have a low end estimate is because they only report on FMS because they're like, DCS is impossible, because the data is so bad for it.
The resolution you had on your first slide is a little different.
Is it?
The one I found online has this. The only difference is it says and/or foreign military sales of arms. So
Oh, did I not have the word of in there?
I don't think so.
That was just a typo then.
Do you think that further limits the topic at all? The definition of arms, or you know, just this first two?
Did I not have arms in that slide? Oh, yeah. Leave it off. That's funny.
I just think that's
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Question about the SIPRI TID system.
Yeah.
I was wondering about like what's significance in using like the price of the arms versus like what they're sold for.
Right.
What's like significance in like the TID system from using like the price of what the arms are made for versus what they're sold for?
Because what they're sold for doesn't necessarily reflect the value of the arm. So, like you could buy an iPhone from one company or another company. It might be the same phone, but one company might pay like $100 more for it.
My name's Pauline, I'm not present. Are you going to upload this PowerPoint on the site? Okay, well, I did on one for our novices, so I just...
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Okay, I'm going to get started. I have a lot to go through. So during the break, Roman pointed out that the resolution that I have on the first slide was wrong, which is ironic. But yeah, I left off the words of arms, which is obviously you should remember the words of arms. Okay, so the next section is direct commercial sales. And so foreign military sales, I think, is relatively straightforward. Direct commercial sales is a little bit more confusing. And it's confusing from a definitional perspective. And at the very start of my lecture, I was like, the terms DCS and FCS are like very straightforward. They're particular programs. There's no debate over that. That is not quite true for direct commercial sales. It's like partly true. This is the definition from the Security Assistance Manual, I think, or Management Manual. I think it's a pretty good definition. And there are kind of three things that I want you to know about this definition, three things that you should write down. Number one is that direct commercial sales are managed entirely by the Department of State. The Department of Defense is not involved whatsoever. Number two is that a direct commercial sale applies between a private defense contractor and the foreign government. So the US government has no role in making the sale. The US government has no role in making the sale. For FMS, the US government has a very strong role in making the sale. They are in charge of negotiating the contract. For DCS, the defense contractor and the foreign customer are the entities that negotiate the contract. If something goes wrong with the contract, the US government is not involved. For FMS, if something goes wrong with the contract, the US government is in charge of figuring that out for the foreign customer. Number three is that the government's role is in issuing export licenses. Export licenses. So the US munitions list is a series of export controls. It says you can't export jets just on your own. Instead, you have to have approval before you can export it. You have to have US government approval that comes from the Department of State, from the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Okay, the next two slides I'm going to show you are a little bit confusing because they contradict something, one thing that I just said. All right, this is the same slide, like Defense Acquisition University, they published another slide about direct commercial sales. It's sort of helpful, I guess. The contract is between a US company and a private entity. The US government, its only role is in providing an export license. The sale, in this instance, the entity that starts the process with the US government is the defense contractor. So the defense contractor applies for the license. They might do that in cooperation with the purchasing country. The defense contractor purchases the license. That license is usually good for 4 years. The license sometimes explains some of the variation in DCS figures because a license might be for like a particular amount of technology, but like the actual purchasing country may not decide to buy as much as they had originally planned, or they might buy more. Now, the confusing part is the last section of this that talks about the Department of Commerce. So a big part of what I'm going to talk about now is export controls and how they work, because we have two primary export control lists. One is the United States Munitions List, the USML, so how you should always flow it. The other is something called the Commerce Control List, the CCL. The U.S. Munitions List is for arms. The CCL is for dual-use items. So things that could be used by the military or could have a civilian purpose. Here's another chart. Like I said, the next two slides contradict a little bit what I said in that opening definition, which specifies only the Department of State. But I think this chart is pretty useful in the sense that it explains the overall organization of the US government. So foreign military, everything's run by the Department of State. Foreign military sales are a program of the Department of State, but managed by the Department of Defense. The regulations governing it are the Security Assistance Manual. This doesn't actually talk about the Department of Defense in it, but because the Department of State is the overall authority for foreign military sales, even though almost everything for the sale itself is run by the DSCA. Direct commercial sales, they have a particular program by the Department of State. The regulations meant to implement that program is ITAR, and then the DTTC is the office that oversees the implementation of that. And both RSAT and DTTC are part of political military affairs. Now, the part of this chart that throws a wrench into my explanation is the section about the Department of Commerce, because there are cards both ways on this question, but there are cards that say that the Department of Commerce has a role in direct commercial sales, because if a defense contractor applies for a license to export something that is on the Commerce Control List, then the Department of Commerce is the agency in charge of that, and they call it a direct commercial sale. The regulations associated with that are called the Export Administration Regulations. They are originally based off of a law passed in 1981 called the Export Administration Act. That law expired in 2001, was kept alive by a series of executive orders, and then was in 2018, Congress passed a law called the Export Control Reform Act that basically codified those or provided authority for export administration regulations. And the agency that enforces the EAR, so the agency that makes determinations of whether or not to grant a license under the Commerce Control List, is called the Bureau of Industry and Security. So they are the Commerce Department's equivalent of the DTTC. Okay, so the next three or four slides, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about export controls. I kind of explained this. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of additional time on this particular slide because I've got a fair amount to cover. But what you need to know is the U.S. munitions list is huge. There are 21 categories, 149 subcategories. What that means is, so categories 1 through 3 of the U.S. munitions list govern things like small arms, and the subcategories are like particular small arms. So 50 caliber machine guns or flamethrowers. Each of those has their own subcategory. The Commerce Control List is only 10 categories. They're all or mostly dual-use items. There's something called the 600 series on the Commerce Control List, and what that refers to is the number that the Department of Commerce categorizes everything, so that they'll give each item a particular product number, and anything that has the number 600 in it is referred to as the 600 series. What that represents is items that the United States government has shifted from the USML to the CCL, which we've been trying to do for a long time. That process is accelerating under the Trump administration. The Trump administration, in fact, wants to move categories 1 through 3 on the USML to the CCL. And the only reason the Trump administration hasn't been able to do that is because it requires congressional notification, and Senator Menendez our hero, placed a legislative hold on that. So it was supposed to occur on February 4th, and he was just like, sorry, legislative hold. So those regulations have not gone into effect. So I wanted to give you like a little bit more of a formal definition of export controls in case that terminology is unclear or if you haven't debated it before. But it really just means that it's a law that prevents sending U.S. technology or U.S. commercial items to other countries for a variety of different purposes. So it could be like national security concerns. It could be that that country is a state sponsor of terrorism. It could be that we think that it might undermine U.S. defense competitiveness. It could be that we think that there's a proliferation risk. We actually have 3 sets of export controls. One of them is explicit to nuclear power and probably is not relevant to this topic. And there are also multilateral export controls, such as the Missile Technology Control Regime. But things like the US munitions list include everything that is a part of a multilateral export control. So multilateral, the MTCR is basically a compact that we negotiated with a bunch of other states. I think like maybe, I'm not actually sure how many other states, that prevents shipping certain missile parts to countries of concern. And those provisions are part of the US munitions list. So even though these are all domestic export controls, our export controls include a variety of, or they've incorporated a variety of multilateral export controls within them. Okay, here are the 21 categories of the US munitions list. I'm not going to spend too much time here just because I've got to move on, but I did want to mention, like, it does say things like nuclear weapons and chemical and biological agents on that. We don't export nuclear weapons. So there is like a formal category of something like nuclear weapons or chemical and biological weapons, but what those are talking about are usually data related to those items. So like our nuclear weapons export control is, we have a prohibition on exporting information about simulating nuclear explosions and their environmental effects to, we can't export that without a license. And we have, some research prohibitions as it relates to certain chemical and biological agents and so forth. But we don't export technology related to those weapons really at all. So this topic is mostly just about conventional weapons, even though the US munitions list is technically broader. Okay, so here, this is just a little bit more process of how export controls work. So the first part about licensing, I've already explained. The one thing on that is just that the Defense Technology Security Agency, part of the Department of Defense, even though they are not involved directly in export licenses, a lot of the time when either Commerce or the DTTC makes a recommendation of whether or not we should export something, they do that based upon a recommendation from the DTSA. They evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. There's no like automatic approval just because we've sent you exports before. They evaluate everything on a case-by-case basis. Certain countries are banned outright. 18 countries are banned outright. And they're banned for various reasons. So if they're on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, then we can't export anything to them. So we would never issue an export license, except virtually everything has the provision for a waiver. So if like we wanted to actually export something to a banned country, we technically could, but it would require the issuance of a national security waiver. Other things, like have they violated other multilateral export controls before? If they have, then we're less likely to approve it. would the export of this particular item contribute to crime? Would it increase the risk of terrorism? Would it increase the risk of proliferation? Would it destabilize the region? Would it cause an arms race? Like, all of those are technically concerns that they're supposed to evaluate when they make an export license recommendation. And then there are some weapons that are just banned outright. We can't export them unless there's a waiver issued, because there's a waiver possibly for everything. And I listed them up there. Okay, so in order to move something from the USML to the CCL, it requires the president notify Congress 30 days in advance. Once something is on the CCL, exporting that item does not require congressional notification. So how do we know what we've exported on the CCL? Unclear. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Border and Customs, or the BCP, both of those are involved in like checking what we export, and they do generate lists based off of that, but there's no formal notification process. The human rights conditions that we apply to DCS and FMS, that we say we apply but don't actually apply, they don't apply to anything on the CCL. The Commerce Department also has an end-use mechanism, but it's not very good. CCL is generally considered more export-friendly, which motivates the drive to move USML items to the CCL. Okay, so this gets back to what I initially said. I said DCS is only the Department of State, not Commerce, and then I showed you two slides, one from the Department of Commerce and one from Defense Acquisition University, that were like, Commerce is in charge of part of DCS. So there is a debate over this. And I'll say, so like when I was preparing this lecture, for like 90% of what I had initially prepared for, I was under the impression that CCL was absolutely part of DCS. But then, just as part of an email conversation with Jeff Abramson, I asked him about the congressional notification part, because he was writing about why things on the CCL didn't require congressional notification to be exported, and why that was potentially a large loophole in our exports and would make it much more difficult to track arms. But he was like a little bit of ambiguous language. So I asked him a question to just clarify it, because I did a little bit of other research and couldn't really find anything definitive on that question. And his response was basically, DCS and CCL are completely different things. That items on the Commerce Control List are not actually part of direct commercial sales. And I was like, I forwarded him a slide from the Department of Commerce, and then I sent him a couple of cards from other like relatively qualified sources, and I'm like, these say it is, can you explain that? And he was like, it is confusing, but sources use terminology very loosely. That the reality is, these things are separate. And I've come to agree with that conclusion after doing a little bit more research. All of this occurred like just a couple of days ago, so it could be researched more. I think there are like pretty good cards in the topicality file, both for the affirmative and the negative on this question, but I do think that the negative side is stronger. Now, the first thing that I looked at is like, what does the actual law say? And when I went to the text of the Arms Export Control Act, it doesn't actually use the word direct commercial sales. And I was like, oh, that's weird. And then I looked at ITAR and the US munitions list, and it doesn't use the word direct commercial sales either. I was like, that's super weird. And then I like did searches within the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations, and mostly came up short. the only definitive sources that define direct commercial sales capitalized, in other words, that refer to the proper noun direct commercial sales program, is the Security Assistance Manual, Management Manual, which I showed you that definition, which is very clear on the subject, and a whole lot of different Department of State publications that are just like, it's only the Department of State. There is a portion in the Code of Federal Regulations and the Export Administration regulations that use the phrases lowercase commercial parentheses direct sales. That's not exactly what the resolution says, but there's evidence on it both ways. The thing that I would say, the reason why I'm a little bit more convinced by the negative side. First, topic experts. So Jeff Abramson is one, but he's not the only one. And also he's very qualified. Somebody who's dedicated his whole life to direct commercial sales and foreign military sales, knows a lot more than I do, and says this is actually how it is. The Security Assistance Monitor, an organization in Washington, D.C. that includes the vast majority of all topic experts, the people that write the cards for particular proposals on this topic, which is based off of the Center for International Policy. They publish the Security Assistance Monitor. They list direct commercial sales and Commerce 600 series sales differently, separately. They categorize them differently. So experts that say that these things are different, I tend to trust. The third reason is I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out and finding good evidence on like anything that said that we should like regulate direct commercial sales off the CCL, and I came up very short. There's not very much literature on it. So I think, while the Department of Commerce and Defense Acquisition University use these terms, and there are other cards in the T-file that use those terms as well, I think that I'm like a little bit more persuaded by the other side. There's also this slide. This slide is a PowerPoint presentation made in 2014 from the head of the DTTC, in other words, the agency that is primarily in charge of direct commercial sales at the State Department, that lists them separately. Provides a definition of foreign military sales, a definition of direct commercial sales, and then a definition of dual use, which is commerce. And I feel like, so like I said, I said at the very beginning, direct commercial sales is an official program of the United States government. There's very little debate over it. I still think that's mostly true. There is this, though. I think, the balance of the negative evidence is better than the affirmative evidence. I don't think there's very much evidence that I've seen that say that we should be, regulating the commerce control list to reduce direct commercial sales. But affirmative teams will likely read affirmatives about that. It's also part of the reason I'm also spending a lot of time on this is that this makes a big deal in terms of circumvention. The U.S. is trying to move items from the USML to the CCL. There's an incentive to do so right now. And if the CCL are not direct commercial sales, that's maybe problematic for the affirmative because it's a built-in way of circumvention that exists. But on the other hand, heroes like Senator Menendez maybe mean that it doesn't matter. Okay. DCS process is a little bit shorter than FMS process. I can take care of all of it in one slide. There are basically 4 steps. First, the defense contractor registers with the DTTC. They are not technically allowed to sell anything or talk to a customer about a sale without registering first, so they all register. 2, they apply for an export license for anything that they've determined that they want to sell. But those negotiations occur, what they should sell and how they would sell it occur entirely between the defense contractor and the purchasing country. Before an export license can be issued, Congress has to be notified. And it's basically the same exact requirements for FMS. So I had like more specific requirements for FMS up there. That whole congressional notification slide, you could just insert that entire thing here. And then fourth, they have end-use monitoring. And state's Blue Lantern program would apply. So when the defense contractor applies for a license, they may not know whether or not they have to apply for apply to the Department of Commerce or the Department of State. In some cases, it's ambiguous, which is part of the reason why the U.S. wants to simplify the process and increase Commerce Department authority over exports, or over dual-use exports. But if they don't, if there is a conflict, if like, somebody applies and Commerce says, yes, we have authority, and then state says, no, we have authority, they can file a request for this to the State Department to say, can you figure this out for us? And the State Department has ultimate jurisdiction over who is in charge in the event of an interagency conflict. Okay, but that's it. Everything else, that's what I've just described there is basically the steps in which the US government is involved. There are other steps between like the private contractor and the purchasing country, but those aren't things that we can really debate about. Okay, last slide for, actually not the last slide for DCS, but this is just a list that I typed up of differences between these two things. So it's like, the only reason I did this, most of this is repetitive. I'm not going to talk about it again because, just because I recognize that a lot of this information is pretty confusing. So hopefully this is a way to organize the information yourself, to like think about the differences between the two programs. This is a time, I still have a ton to get through, but I will take a couple of questions if anybody has any confusion about DCS versus FMS while you're like copying down this slide. So if there are any questions, and probably spare like a minute. Or not. Okay.
So you talked about from the topicality question for the commerce control list, whether it's included in direct commercial sales. Is there any ambiguity over whether it's included in arms and whether arms is the same thing as direct commercial sales or potentially more or less?
So that gets back to the definition of arms. And one of the things that I said about arms is that from a legal perspective, they are defined as defense articles and services on the U.S. munitions list.
Yeah, so, I mean, is there any evidence that suggests it would meet arms even? Because it seems like there's a controversy of whether or not it meets DCS, but if it doesn't mean arms, then that seems kind of irrelevant.
Oh, okay, so I think I get your question. Yeah, so there are a lot of items on the commerce control list that are definitely not arms. Like the majority of it. What we're mostly talking about here is the 600 series, which is dual use items, mostly dual use items, or sometimes even exclusive military use items, but aren't like directly involved in like creating lethality. Things that were shifted from the USML to the CCL. So are those things arms under the definition of arms? I mean, if arms are like defined by what's on the U.S. munitions list, then probably not. If instead the judge is supposed to look at dual use items on the CCL that are defense articles and services, then maybe. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm going to post this slide, or I'll post this lecture, so if you haven't copied down everything, you have another opportunity to review it. Okay. So I have two more slides related to DCS, although these are like related to both programs in general. One of the first questions that I had about the topic is like, are FMS and DCS the only way in which we transfer arms? And the answer to that question is No, they're not. We have several different ways to transfer arms, which is potentially a built-in circumvention argument for the topic. But there's an asterisk to that because most of these ways are not very significant. So we do a lot of things. All of these programs, or not all of these programs, but I think all of them except for building partner capacity are authorized by the Foreign Assistance Act, the FAA, and some of them are a little bit confusing. So leases, for example, there are leases that are considered foreign military sales because there's a lease provision of the AECA. But there is also a separate lease provision of the FAA that has its own set of requirements that are not FMS. But a lease is just like we basically, rent them equipment usually for a period of 4 years. So they can still use it even if we haven't actually sold it to them or transferred it to them under the FMS program or DCS program. So one more thing, the word sales in the topic is a little bit misleading because not everything under FMS or DCS are actual sales. We do provide them items and they still count as FMS, even if we give it to them free of charge. But there are specific formal programs that we have that are mechanisms to transfer arms to other countries that are outside of the FMS and DCS programs. So leases, there are statutory caps. The amount of the lease that we can provide in any given year is really small. So it's not actually a great source of circumvention unless the affirmative is really small. Excess defense articles is a program of the Department of Defense that either transfers or even sells items to other countries of defense articles that we've decided we no longer need. But even though we can sell them at heavily reduced rates, they're not part of the foreign military sales program. But again, not used very much. Emergency drawdowns is assistance that the president can, at their discretion, provide to another country from existing Department of Defense stocks. So even if it's not an excess defense article, even if it's a plane that we use frequently and we rely on, technically the president has authority to transfer that plane to another country if he declares there's an emergency purpose behind it. But again, there's a statutory cap. It's really low. I think it's like $200 million a year. So the president can't do that for more than $200 million for a particular year and not more than, I think, $50 million to any individual country. So it's a very limited exception. Building partner capacity is a weird one. That is like potentially a larger source of circumvention because this was a program that was created after September 11th, originally designed primarily for Afghanistan and Iraq, where there were some US members of Congress who were like, Iraq and Afghanistan are not getting the defense materials that we need to give them in enough time, that the FMS and DCS process are taking too long. So we need to create a new program that they've called Building Partner Capacity that is an avenue to transfer these weapons to those countries. And in the literature, this program is frequently referred to as pseudo-FMS because it mimics FMS processes in every way, but it's not authorized by the ACEA, and it's not formally part of FMS. And when I say it mimics that process. So there's a letter of request, and there's a letter of offer and acceptance. But the letter of request is written by the US government. The letter of offer and acceptance is accepted by the US government. So it is really just a way for the US to transfer something to another country that is a way for them to basically provide them materials a little bit faster. Is this an actual circumvention argument? There's very, very good evidence that says it's not part of the FMS program. Would it be used in response to the plan? I don't know. I haven't seen any cards, but maybe. Yeah. That's a good question, and I don't remember. So it might not. There is a definitive answer to that question. I just don't remember, and I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. Section 614 waiver of authority is part of the Foreign Assistance Act. It's another emergency authority that allows us to transfer an item to another country. There's a cap on how much we can do that. International cooperative programs are ways of which we develop weapons jointly with other countries. We do that outside of the FMS process, but we could technically say, hey, Saudi Arabia, we want to, build a new type of jet with you, and we'll provide you money to assist in that process. So it's all technically ways in which circumvention is possible. I don't know how threatening this is to the affirmative. I haven't seen great cards that say that these are ways that might take out affirmative solvency, but there are definitely some cards, so we'll see. Okay, last part of this section is the Leahy law, which maybe fits in here, maybe doesn't. It is something you need to know, so it's pretty important. So the Leahy law is two laws that were passed in 1997 in response to what was perceived as human rights abuses surrounding a program we called Plan Colombia, which we provided counter-narcotics assistance to Colombia. But as part of that assistance, we ended up empowering Colombia's military to commit all kinds of really nasty human rights violations against people that they said were growing cocaine. What this does is it is a formal human rights restriction that says that if an individual military unit is found as violating human rights, then we may not transfer assistance to that particular unit. So it doesn't apply to the country. We can still send things to Colombia. We just can't send it to the individual members of the Colombian military that are engaged in human rights abuses. So it doesn't apply to DCS at all. There are recommendations that say it should apply to DCS, so it's arguably a topical affirmative. It doesn't really apply to FMS. It only applies to FMS that is financed by foreign military financing. And those are interpretations by the State Department and Defense. So technically, you could just change their interpretation to comply with the Leahy law. All right, next section. I'm actually going to skip 2 of the slides for this because there's a few more things that I need to talk about. So I'm really just going to talk about this first slide. First thing is there are multiple definitions of reduce. There are some reduced T violations. None of them are very good. They're in fact all trash. But the definition of reduce, I just put up there. That's a definition that's used in more than 20 Supreme Court decisions. You could really search that phrase to see how many were used. But reduce just means to decrease the number. The real question on this topic is how do we measure whether a reduction has occurred? Because arms sales is a weird thing to reduce because we can't take back sales. Once we ship something to Saudi Arabia, they have it. We can't take it back. There's no provision for us to repossess it. So an affirmative can't do it that way. And, technically, when a letter of request is sent and there's congressional notification, I guess Congress could say no, but the sale hasn't happened at that point, so is it a reduction of the sale? I don't know. And I think the answer to that question really has to be determined by contextual evidence. The word reduce is not a term of art. It's not something that any arms sales expert has ever defined. There are really good definitions of reduce, but they're in very, very different contexts. There is, however, exceptionally good evidence that uses the term reduce in the context of arms sales. to mean a lot of different things. And I've listed a lot of the things the ways in which you could reduce something. So you could refuse authorization, technically. I don't think many affirmatives will do that, because that is like refusing authorization for a single sale, and that would require them to have like highly specific evidence that says this sale is about to occur, we need to prevent that, which in certain contexts, could happen, but probably not, because it's only a single sale, potentially has other typicality problems for like being not substantial, for example. You could strengthen export controls. You could create an embargo. You could say certain weapons may not be exported at all, such as drones. You could embargo particular countries. You could impose a numerical ceiling, which is something that President Carter did in 1977, which is, by the way, the only example where the U.S. has ever reduced arms sales. President Carter, 1977, imposed a numerical ceiling. So where he was like, we can't sell more than X amount. How did he come up with that ceiling? He based it upon prior year's sales. So to me, the best answer to how do you measure a reduction is you have to compare it against prior years, and potentially multiple years, because an individual single year doesn't tell you very much about how many weapons we're selling to a particular country. Now, you can impose conditions on sales, and there's definitions of reduce that say like reduce does not mean suspend. Those definitions are horrible. The affirmative definitions are better. But one thing that I'll say about that is that every single thing that we could possibly have ever done to prohibit a sale or try to prohibit a sale involves a condition. Every single one. So the easiest example that I can use is the terrorist list. We cannot sell things to North Korea today. But what if North Korea all of a sudden became a democracy tomorrow? We would definitely sell things to them despite the demand. So every single ban always has a condition for the resumption of sales, and there's pretty good evidence to support that particular claim. So I'm running really short on time, but the kind of main takeaway from this is that what might seem as rhetorically powerful definitions of reduce are never in the context of arms sales and make no sense in the context of an arms sales topic, because of everything that I just explained to you about the process, which means the only real definition you need is what's up there, and you have to be able to explain how a reduction should be measured. So if you're affirmative, you just need to be like, we measure the reduction in the sale based upon prior years. That means we cut off a sale, it's less than what we've given them over prior exports, therefore it is a reduction. Maybe not. I mean, you could, but you, like the affirmative would have to like ban the sale. So they'd be like, we're going to ban the sale and, the sale to Saudi Arabia until they improve the state of women's rights within Saudi Arabia. There's an advocate for that I've seen, so. Okay, I'm skipping those slides. Now we're going to move to specific policy. That's Trump on his first international visit abroad to Saudi Arabia, doing, inking some arms sales, although this I think was taken in DC. So one major thing you need to know, this whole section is just about like various policies that you really need to know a lot about, because they are like the more contemporary ways in which this topic will unfold. The first, and I think by far the most important, is the conventional arms transfer policy, which refers to an executive order passed by Trump in April 2018. Throughout history, there have been 5 conventional arms transfers policies. And what it is the president sets the policy for how agencies have to interpret arms sales, or how agencies have to, implement arms sales policy for the administration. So they are generally goals and statements of purpose, but they are goals and statements of purpose that guide agency behavior in terms of how they promote arms sales. So Carter implemented the first one in 1977, which was an actual reduction in arms sales. It didn't last. Reagan implemented the second one in 1981, which was a big expansion. Clinton did one in 1995, and then that became policy all the way until Obama in 2014, and then Trump in 2018. The reason that I mentioned that history is because Trump is the first president to explicitly say that the primary purpose of arms sales is economic benefits. Like, why does the U.S. export arms? We do it for a variety of reasons. Officially, prior to Trump's C-18, our primary reasons were it's really important to support allies, so it's a form of building relations and cooperation. It's something that we make sure that allies have defense needs, that their defense needs are met. One of the historical reasons why we started increasing arms sales was in response to the Vietnam War, where we didn't want to send our military to other places. So instead, we exported a lot of arms under the theory that if our allies could defend themselves, the U.S. wouldn't need to intervene. So part of the goal of arms sales is to build up allied defense relationships, so to reduce the burden on the U.S. military.